he wasn't perfect. George Harrison did things that even John Lennon wouldn't do. At 80 years old, Eric Clapton, his best friend, and also the man who once hurt George, has finally spoken up after 50 years. He told the dark secrets he's kept like a wound that never got better. Times when Harrison got lost in his love for spirituality, secret relationships with Ringo Starr's wife, and the messy love triangle with Pattie Boyd, the woman who broke both their hearts. Clapton said, "I used to think I was the bad guy, but then I saw George wasn't so perfect either." So why did it take him until 80 to tell everything? Was it to deal with his own guilt, or because George's death left him with a question he never answered? Let's follow Clapton's words to discover who George Harrison really was behind the good guy image the world believed in. After 50 years of staying quiet, Eric Clapton has finally shared the darkest part of his friendship with George Harrison, the man the world once thought was the Holy Beatle. In an interview recorded in Surrey, England, Clapton spoke in a low, rough voice. "People saw peace in George. I saw a storm. He wasn't perfect." Clapton remembered that around 1967, when the Beatles were super popular with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, George began to change. He became interested in Indian philosophy, meditation, and the sitar, and the British newspapers praised him as the smart Beatle. But according to Clapton, behind that calm look was a troubled soul. George was the first to bring LSD into the Abbey Road studio, Clapton said, and he was the last to leave when things got out of control. During the day, Harrison talked about karma and freedom. At night, he would leave his Friar Park mansion and drive to Chelsea, where private clubs stayed open till morning. Clapton remembered. He said he was looking for wisdom, but every time he came back, his eyes looked more empty. That was a very different George from the quiet Beatle the public loved. Clapton also told a story that, in his words, made me both mad and sad. Once in 1968, he recorded a blues demo for himself, only to hear weeks later George brought in a song that was almost the same, except for a few chords. When Clapton asked about it, George just smiled and said, "I didn't copy you. God inspired me." Clapton admitted, "I said nothing, but deep down, I knew he had lost the line between faith and lying." By 1969, as the Beatles were breaking up, George seemed to be the calm one, the peacemaker. But Clapton said he was the one who lit the fuse. He remembered one evening at Friar Park when George drank and laughed. "If John and Paul fight, at least I'll get a few extra songs for the album." To Clapton, that wasn't funny. It was wanting success disguised as being calm. The media called George the man who brought meditation into music. But Clapton disagreed. He didn't meditate for peace. He meditated for attention. According to him, George's feeling of not being good enough at being the fourth Beatle made him secretly compete with Lennon and McCartney. And that quiet jealousy, not fame, not too much of anything, was, Clapton said, the real fire that burned down the greatest band ever. Clapton ended with a scary line. George wasn't a victim of the Beatles. He was the spark that destroyed them. For the first time at 80, Eric Clapton dared to name the truth he had avoided all his life, that his best friend, the world's quiet Beatle, may never have truly been at peace. After the Beatles broke up in 1970, the world believed George Harrison had finally found the life he wanted, peaceful, away from fame, next to his beautiful wife, Pattie Boyd. British newspapers often showed them George playing sitar in the Friar Park garden, Pattie reading under the afternoon sun. They were called the spiritual couple of the New Age, the symbol of pure love between music and meditation. But to Eric Clapton, who often visited their home, things looked very different. He said, "I used to think George was the most loyal husband in the world until I saw him look at another woman with the same eyes Pattie once dreamed of." According to Clapton, during the All Things Must Pass recording sessions, 1970 to 1971, cracks began to show in their marriage. Pattie often sat quietly for hours in the studio, waiting for George to finish. But many nights when the music stopped, George was nowhere to be found. He often disappeared with Maureen Starkey, Ringo Starr's wife, their close friend, and George's bandmate's wife. Clapton remembered, "I once saw them leave the studio together, shoulder to shoulder with a look they couldn't hide. I froze in the hallway. George looked at me and smiled. The kind of smile only someone doing something wrong tries to make look normal." Rumors spread quickly among close friends. When Ringo found out, he left home for a long time. But George, instead of feeling sorry, went deeper into what he called universal love. Clapton said George believed love shouldn't be limited by earthly rules. He told me, "Love is karma, and I don't apologize for what my heart wants." To the public, Harrison was a man of faith, teaching about wisdom and kindness. But Clapton saw the opposite. George could chant for hours, then use those same words to excuse betrayal. He talked about freedom, but chained himself to wanting things. When Patty found out, she broke down. One evening at Clapton's home in Chelsea, she told him, "I don't recognize the man I married anymore. George isn't the gentle boy from Liverpool. He thinks God allows everything." That was the moment Clapton realized he loved her, not out of sudden feelings, but out of feeling sorry for a woman forgotten in the shadow of fame. At first, that love was silent. Clapton said, "I watched her cry and I understood, but I couldn't say a word. She was my friend's wife. Yet the guilt grew too much to handle." By 1971, torn between anger and heartbreak, Clapton wrote Layla, the song the world thought was a love confession. But for him, it was an angry letter to George Harrison. "I didn't write Layla just because I loved Patty," Clapton said. "I wrote it because I was angry. Angry that George taught about kindness while betraying the people who loved him most." Layla was born in chaos, drugs, alcohol, and a love he couldn't have. But in every chord, Clapton sent a message only George would understand. "You're not the saint people think you are." When asked about the song at a London party, George only smiled and said, "I know who that song is for, but love doesn't belong to anyone." To Clapton, it was the coldest thing he'd ever heard. Years later, George and Patty's marriage completely fell apart. They argued, grew apart, and finally divorced in 1974. Patty left Friar Park carrying the memory of a man she once thought was holy, only to realize he was a sinner in a saint's clothing. Clapton and Patty eventually got together, but he never saw it as winning. "I didn't steal my friend's wife," Clapton said in his final interview. "I took back what he had thrown away." As he spoke, his voice cracked, his eyes distant. "I don't regret loving Patty. I regret believing George was better than me." And perhaps in those early 1970s, with love, betrayal, and jealousy, one of the most beautiful friendships in music history fell apart, leaving behind only sad songs and souls that never found forgiveness. Love lost, fame fading, and friends gone separate ways all seemed to push George Harrison into a scary emptiness. Clapton remembered, "After Patty left, George wasn't the man I knew. He didn't talk about music or friends, only about God." From 1975, Harrison almost disappeared into his Friar Park estate, the old Oxfordshire mansion he once called the home of the soul. To outsiders, it was heaven, gardens of sunlight, lotus ponds, and sitar music. But to Clapton, it was a strange world where George lived like a crazy hermit. He believed meditation and music could save his soul, Clapton said. But it wasn't meditation anymore. It was ritual. Once a month, George held what he called nights of cleansing. Clapton was invited one winter evening in 1976. He remembered the main hall filled with incense smoke and candlelight. George, dressed in white robes with a scarf around his head, stood with several monks from India. He made everyone kneel and chant mantras for hours. Clapton remembered. If anyone stopped, he'd stare at them and say, "Your soul isn't awake yet." At midnight, Drums began pounding fast, fierce. Harrison told everyone to drum out the evil from your body. Clapton said, "I'd never seen George like that." His eyes were glowing, his voice powerful. I didn't know if it was faith or craziness. Later, George told Clapton that John Lennon's spirit, his old friend and partner, still came through the incense each night. Clapton remembered his tone clearly. "John hasn't gone anywhere. He still talks to me through the smoke." At first, Clapton thought George was just trying to find peace. But as time went on, he became more extreme. Visitors were asked to chant before eating, and those who refused were called people who don't understand. He once made me put my guitar on an altar and promise never to play unless I thought of God, Clapton said. I did it just to keep him calm. But as I left, I knew George was no longer living in our world. The rituals grew stranger. Friends avoided him while the British media praised him as a beetle of wisdom. Clapton said bitterly, "People worshipped his image without knowing what he was afraid of." Because according to him, George wasn't finding forgiveness. He was running from guilt. The affair with Maureen, his failed marriage, and the years lost in fame. Another time in 1978, Clapton visited Friar Park. George led him into a small room with a painting of Lord Krishna surrounded by hundreds of candles. George whispered, "I've seen the light. I know where John is." Clapton stayed silent. He knew his friend had gone too far and didn't want to come back. George didn't need friends anymore. Clapton said he needed followers. When asked why he didn't step in, Clapton replied, "I tried." But whenever I told him he was losing himself, George would smile and say, "I didn't understand true spirituality." Maybe he was right. Maybe all I understood was loneliness. In 1980, when John Lennon was killed in New York, Harrison completely broke down. For months, he barely left Friar Park. Clapton said that when he visited, George burned incense all night and played "Here Comes the Sun" with strange chords, then stopped and cried. He believed John was listening, Clapton said. I think by then, George didn't know who he was talking to anymore. The world still believed Harrison was the beetle of peace, the man who found light after darkness. But Clapton said directly, he wasn't peaceful. He was haunted. He didn't find God. He was running from himself. Clapton paused, tapping his fingers slowly on the table. When I think of George in those years, I don't see a saint. I see a desperate man trying to erase his guilt by wearing the mask of wisdom. And perhaps it was in those smoke-filled rituals at Friar Park that the image of the quiet beetle the world loved began to fall apart. Because, as Clapton said, when a man starts talking to the spirits of the dead, it means he can no longer hear his own voice. His voice dropped, ready to open the next chapter of the story. When George slowly lost himself in faith, Paddy came back with another wound. A wound that neither he nor I could heal. After years of betrayals, breakups, and pain, it seemed everything had finally ended when Eric Clapton and Pattie Boyd officially got married in the spring of 1979 in Tucson, Arizona. The British press called it a fairy tale ending to one of rock's most famous love triangles. As for George Harrison, Pattie's ex-husband and once Clapton's close friend, he was at the ceremony. He even laughed, hugged, and gave his blessings, leading the media to believe that all had been forgiven. But as Clapton later told, that forgiveness was a bitter show. George was never angry with me, and perhaps that was what scared me most, Clapton said in a 2025 interview. He held no anger, no hate, only silence. But in that silence, I felt something very not normal. Clapton said that just weeks after the wedding, George began calling Pattie, sometimes simply to check in, sometimes to say meaningless things in the middle of the night. Once he called Clapton at 2 o'clock in the morning just to say, "Love her as I once did, or more." Clapton understood that deep down, George had never truly let Pattie go. He still saw her as his, Clapton said. Whenever George got drunk, he'd come to my house, knock on the door with a bottle and a guitar. We'd drink until morning. He would pray and then fall asleep on the couch. He wasn't angry with me, but I knew he never forgot. Patty felt it too. She told Clapton that George had a strange belief about love and being reborn. He told her, "In another world, there is no owning. Patty can love both of us because souls aren't tied down." At the time, Patty just smiled it off. But later, she told Clapton that sometimes George really frightened her. He would look at me as if he were talking to someone standing behind me. She said, someone only he could see. Clapton remembered a night in 1981 when George came by after a London concert. He was very drunk, sitting in the living room with a faraway look. Suddenly, George said, "If I die, I'll merge into you. That way, I'll still have Patty, and she'll never leave us." Clapton said he didn't dare laugh. George said it with a serious tone. He truly believed there was a spiritual connection between us, something beyond life and death. In the early years of their marriage, Clapton and Patty tried to live normally, but George's presence was always there. The late-night calls, the short notes from Friar Park with wishes like, "Hope she's happy." They were like marks that could never fade. Clapton said, "At times I felt like we were living in a house of three." The pressure began to crack their marriage. Patty, though trying to stay calm, often dreamed of George. She told Clapton that in her dreams, George still played guitar and smiled, calling her the angel of rebirth. Clapton said, "She told me that, with a confused look, as if she didn't know whether to be happy or afraid." The press kept writing that Harrison and Clapton had become close friends again, performing together at charity events. But according to Clapton, it was all surface. "We smiled on stage, but in his eyes, I saw something like owning," he said. George didn't need Patty, but he didn't want anyone else to have her either. By the late 1980s, as Clapton fell into alcohol and Patty grew distant, George's calls continued. Some nights he would quietly ask, "Is she happy?" Other nights, he said, "I just dreamed the three of us were playing music together in another life." Clapton admitted that deep down he knew George had never forgiven. "He didn't hate me, didn't get angry at me, but he couldn't leave me in peace," he said. "Every time Patty came up, I saw his eyes change as if he were looking at something sacred I had hurt." Finally, in a rare interview, Patty told something that made Clapton shiver. "George once told me that if he died, he would enter Eric to keep me forever." Hearing that, Clapton fell silent. I didn't know if it was love, obsession, or a part of his spiritual passion he never escaped. He looked down, his voice low and heavy. By then, I understood that between George and me, Patty was just a soul caught in the middle, a woman standing between two worlds, one of human life and one of things not yet let go. And it was in that period, Clapton said, that he truly began to fear George. Not because of the calls or the eyes, but because he felt that even after losing Patty, George still found a way to exist in their lives quietly, constantly, and never leaving. The last years of the 1980s closed with a strange quietness in the relationship between Eric Clapton and George Harrison. After years of avoiding pain and inner struggle, both seemed to accept what could not be changed. Patty had gone. Fame had faded, leaving only music and memories that couldn't be erased. Clapton said, "We didn't see each other much anymore, but sometimes when I picked up the guitar, I could hear him. Maybe because even apart, we still owed each other." The 1990s to the world were a time of coming back for Clapton. But for George Harrison, they were years of fading. He appeared rarely in public, going back to the old Friar Park estate in Oxfordshire. The press wrote that George lived peacefully, gardening, meditating, and writing music. But Clapton said the truth was different. He no longer made music out of love, but out of fear of being forgotten. Harrison had been the quiet Beatle, often overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney. And now, as they had left the stage, George feared the world would forget him. Clapton said, Every time I visited, he would ask, "Do they still remember me, Eric?" I didn't know how to answer. In the small studio at Friar Park, Harrison still played every day. But among those songs lingered the heavy smell of drink and smoke. Clapton said he drank not to enjoy, but for memories. Some nights I heard him put on Something, the song he wrote for Patty, and quietly cry. One evening Clapton visited. George invited him to sit, poured 2 drinks, and said tiredly, "You know, I wrote something to keep her. But now, I just want to remember what being loved felt like." Clapton didn't reply. He understood this was no longer the friend he once knew, but a soul trying to make peace with himself. Around this time, Harrison began handwriting letters to those once close to him. One reached Clapton in 1998. Just a single line, "I forgive, but I don't forget." Clapton said that when he read it, he just stared at the page. "I knew what he meant about Patty, about Ringo, about everything. He forgave me, but he still hadn't forgiven himself." Lung cancer came knocking at the end of the 1990s. He still showed up a few times, always with a gentle smile and soft eyes, making everyone think he was at peace. But Clapton said George wasn't at peace. He feared leaving, feared being forgotten, feared the things left unsolved. In 1999, Clapton flew to Los Angeles to see George. By then, he was thin, pale, his voice barely more than a whisper. But when he held a guitar, George still played "Here Comes the Sun." Slow, shaking, strangely beautiful. Mid-song, he stopped, smiled, and said, "If I go first, keep our music alive. Don't let it fade with me." Clapton said I nodded, but inside, I was broken. I knew he was ready for the final journey. At the end of 2000, George was put in the hospital for the first time. The media said he was tired, but Clapton knew the harsher truth. He had no strength left to fight. Yet, he still spoke of music, of a performance he wanted to hold, not for himself, but for those who had gone before. When John Lennon was taken 2 decades earlier, Harrison once said, "I won't let his passing become a tragedy. It will be a song." And now facing his own end, he held to that belief. Clapton remembered. He said, "When I go, don't cry. Play music. Play it loud so I can hear." On November 29, 2001, George Harrison passed away in Los Angeles. Clapton was among the first to hear. I sat down, unable to speak. He said, "In that moment, I felt I'd lost not only a friend, but the rest of my youth." But for Clapton, the story wasn't over. He knew he had to do something, not only to honor George, but to make up for all that remained unsaid between them. A year later, in November 2002, Clapton organized the concert for George at London's Royal Albert Hall. He invited old friends, the musicians who had helped George define rock's golden era. On stage, Clapton said little. He simply stood there, guitar in hand, bathed in warm light. When the first notes of Something rang out, the hall fell silent. Clapton said, "I wasn't just honoring him, I was making up for things." That song once again returned to where it belonged, to a place of love, betrayal, regret, and forgiveness. When the music ended, the hall burst into applause that wouldn't stop. Clapton bowed, tears on his face. He whispered just loud enough for the microphone to catch. George left in the light. But that light was lit from the darker pieces of both of us. In that moment, perhaps the world finally understood why those 2 men, one called the guitar god, the other, the quiet Beatle, remained tied in such a strange friendship for life. A friendship built on music, betrayal, forgiveness, and kindness, where neither was perfect, and that being imperfect made them timeless. Clapton closed the story with a warm but shaking voice. "I've lived long enough to know that forgiveness doesn't erase wrongdoing. It simply makes us grateful. We still have the chance to tell the truth. And that is why at 80 he finally dared to say it all, so that somewhere George Harrison could hear a late apology from the friend who hurt him the most, but also loved him the most." Nearly 2 decades after George Harrison's passing, an 80-year-old Eric Clapton finally broke his silence with a confession that shocked the world. In a small room in Surrey, where the late-day sun made a dusty glow through the window, Clapton sat before the camera for what was seen as a final unburdening. His voice sank, shaking yet clear. "All my life, people thought I betrayed my friend. But the truth is, he betrayed the image the world worshipped." Clapton didn't speak with anger, but with a mixed-up feeling of love and regret. He called George the most saintly man and the most flawed I ever knew. "George could make anyone believe he'd found the light," Clapton said. "But within that light, there remained a shadow he never dared face." The interviewer asked why only now. Clapton was silent for a long time, then replied, "Because only now am I brave enough to stop treating him like a hero. I owe George the truth, not a statue." Throughout the conversation, Clapton recalled memories like pictures from an old film, nights they played until morning, silences that needed no words, and the strange looks George left him before leaving forever. He said there are things he still can't explain, things that made him believe a bond existed between them beyond death. "George once told me, 'If I could, I would be reborn in your body to finish my unfinished life.' At the time, I thought he was joking, but after he was gone, there were nights I held the guitar and truly heard him there in every chord, every note." Clapton gave a small smile as he said this, eyes drifting past the camera. "Once I was playing while my guitar gently weeps on stage, and I felt my hands no longer belonged to me. That sound was George's." For Clapton, the years after losing his friend weren't a release, but an invisible path of making up. The older he grew, the more he understood that between them, two men who loved, envied, and hurt, there was no pure victim, no one totally at fault. "We were two sides of the same mirror," Clapton said. "He reflected my better self. I reflected his true human self, weak, afraid, and full of mistakes." Clapton said he had tried many times to write a book about Harrison, but always stopped on the first page. "I was afraid people would misunderstand. I'm not telling this to ruin him. I'm telling it so people know George was human, not a saint." He paused, took a deep breath, and continued. "I want people to understand. George stumbled. He was fragile. He lost his way. But that's exactly why he was great. No one becomes light without walking through darkness." "Here," Clapton bowed his head, his voice breaking. "We hurt each other, but in the end, that pain tied us together. I'm no longer angry at him. I just miss him. And I know somewhere George is smiling. Not as a legend, but as a man truly seen." The interviewer fell silent. Only the soft wind at the window and the distant hum of the guitar beside the chair remained. Clapton looked down at his shaking hands and spoke slowly. "All my life, I've played thousands of songs, but only one person made me believe music has a soul, George. Every time I play a note, I still hear him as if he never left." A tear rolled down his cheek, not of guilt, but of relief. He spoke softly, as if closing everything. "I've told it all not to be forgiven, but to let him know. I understand now. I understand why he turned to faith, why he feared loneliness, why he couldn't stop with Patty. I understand because we were more alike than we ever knew." Clapton lifted his head, his eyes carrying a gentle sadness, as if speaking to a friend beyond. "George wasn't a saint. He was a man with desires, faults, and a real belief in love and salvation." He placed a hand on the guitar, brushed the strings once, and spoke the line later remembered as Eric Clapton's final confession. "And that's the only truth I still have the courage to say." In that moment, the legend faded, and there was only an old man saying goodbye to his friend, one who had swept through his life like a storm, leaving in music, in mistakes, and in memory notes that would never stop ringing. When the interview ended, Eric Clapton said only one sentence: "George wasn't a saint. He was human, and I love him for that." After half a century of silence, Clapton finally told everything not to put down, but to make sure his friend would be remembered as a real person with both light and shadow. Because behind every legend are untold stories, truths only those inside dare to speak. If you want more people to know the truths behind Hollywood's legends, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next part, where Patty Boyd reveals for the first time the final secret between the two men who loved her with all their souls.